One of the main roles of science, outside of gathering knowledge for knowledge's sake, is to assist decision makers by helping them make informed predictions concerning the most likely outcomes of their actions. Ideally, scientists gather data by performing controlled experiments using two identical groups in which a test is performed on one of them but not the other. By examining differences in outcomes between the two groups, we can make the educated guess that the test is what caused the specific outcome. However, when dealing with large-scale population-level problems such as planning for epidemics or natural disasters, or analyzing the effectiveness of government initiatives, it's generally not possible to perform these kinds of controlled experiments. To analyze these kind of events, scientists, economists, and government officials will often make use of simulations. By making educated guesses about the mechanisms and variables impacting the outcome of an event, a computer can be used to predict what the results of a particular action will be. After the action is taken, the model can be checked to see how well it predicted the outcome, and adjustments to the model can be made to better predict and plan for similar events in the future. In principle, this method of analysis is not exclusive to scientists. Almost everyone tries to analyze the world by making guesses, making predictions based on those guesses, and modifying their outlook if real-world observations fail to match their predictions. In the modern age of information, it isn't hard to find raw data on whatever subject one happens to be interested in. But extracting useful information from piles and piles of wordy scientific reports can be difficult, confusing, and time-consuming, and people generally want answers that are simple, straightforward, and certain, especially during a crisis. So people will instead turn to authorities they trust, such as medical practitioners, politicians, media outlets, and so on, to explain the situation in simple terms. The problem is that these sources typically have their own motivations for convincing their followers of one thing or another, and the theories they present are by necessity crude and oversimplified. In order to support their theories, they will selectively present fragments of the real studies that actual scientists use to construct and refine their models and simulations, giving them an air of credibility. But since the layperson lacks the mathematical skills and technological tools to convert the numbers from these studies into predictive models, the details of the studies themselves will generally be ignored or forgotten in favor of remembering the headline or the claim that the person presenting the study wants to make. And this is a problem because it isn't difficult to convince someone that 2 + 2 = 5 when they aren't actually paying attention to the numbers. The ultimate result of this is that most people wind up believing in crude theories supported by studies they barely remember, selected by biased sources making predictions so vague that pretty much any real-world observation can be treated as evidence that reinforces their existing belief. A far cry from the way scientists with actual predictive models operate. While using statistics to manipulate people is nothing new, it wasn't until the coronavirus pandemic of 2020 that I really started to get a grasp of the magnitude of the problem. People for lockdowns and against lockdowns, for vaccines and against vaccines, were each accusing each other of causing the deaths of literally millions of people. Trusting the experts wasn't an option because people on both sides of the debate were each calling themselves experts, and what made matters particularly confusing was that both sides were more often than not pulling their raw numbers from the same sources, yet coming to wildly different conclusions. Raw numbers from countries around the world were constantly pouring in, but the math needed to analyze that data was far too complicated for an unaided person to have a hope of figuring out who was telling the truth and who was lying through their teeth, forcing many to choose who to put their trust in based on political affiliation or personal charisma. And this is a major problem, because if even something as objective as the physical cause of mass death was up for debate, then when it came to the politics of something more abstract like group identity, we might as well be blindfolded monkeys bumbling in the dark. So I set out on a mission, to find a source who can not only say what was going on, but could show it. Someone with a simulation that defined the facts and could make predictions that matched up with the raw numbers we actually saw. While I was able to find plenty of disease simulators, I ran into a problem. The ones designed for the general public, at least those I could find, were not only heavily biased in favor of demonstrating a single perspective, but were also far too simple to actually make any real predictions. They were teaching tools designed to demonstrate a concept, which is fair enough, but it wouldn't really serve my purposes, because if the model couldn't predict real-world events, how could I verify whether the concepts it demonstrates actually represented reality? And if they didn't account for all possible relevant variables, how could I check whether or not those variables actually changed the outcome? In other words, if you already agreed with the viewpoint of the simulation's creator, it was fine. But if you didn't, it would be trivial to dismiss them with whataboutisms, and then you're right back where you started. Since I wasn't able to find a simulator I was satisfied with, I decided to make one myself. It would need to be fully customizable, meaning that the user would be able to add as many variables as they wanted to account for all possible factors they might consider relevant. It would need to be able to handle large populations of hundreds of millions at least, because that's the size of the real-world populations I'd be testing its predictions against. It would need to be able to work without requiring the user to use any high-level math, because I wanted to make something extremely accessible, something that anyone could use to model and test their own theories. And it would need to run on an ordinary computer for the same reason. In this video series, I'm going to be demonstrating a population simulation program, which I have called Pathogenic. The simulation is built around two core concepts, traits and vectors. Traits are qualities that differentiate one member of the simulated population from another. These traits may refer to possible stages in progression of a disease, qualities which may affect a person's likelihood of the disease state changing, or qualities which may tangentially impact those traits, or qualities which have nothing to do with disease at all. Vectors represent the tendency of people with a given trait to affect the people around them, which they do by adding or removing traits. Vectors can also represent the likelihood of a trait affecting people who have that trait over time, which is also done by adding or removing traits. And traits can also increase or decrease the likelihood of a vector making an impact. To demonstrate, let's use the program to make a very simple simulation of an epidemic. We'll start by creating a site with a population of, let's say, 10 million people. Then, we'll create two traits, susceptible and infected. We'll set the susceptible trait to have a starting probability of 1, meaning that the entire population will be susceptible at first. We then create a vector called virus to represent the viral vector. We then give the infected trait a transmit event, which will add the infected trait and remove the susceptible trait using a virus-type vector. Each infected person will have a 50% chance of releasing the vector each day, meaning that on average, an infected person will infect one other person every 2 days. Now, we have to make sure that there are a few people infected at the beginning of the simulation, so let's add 10 similar vectors to the site's starting vectors. This will infect 10 people at the beginning of the simulation. Now we started. As the simulation runs, the number of people infected increases exponentially over time, and the susceptible people who have not been infected yet decrease. The speed of increase declines near the end, since the vectors are likely to infect someone who is already infected. To model recovery, we need to add a new trait, recovered. We will also give people with the recovered trait an infect modifier that multiplies the chance of being affected by a virus-type vector by 0, meaning that once they recover, they can never be infected again. Now we need to make infected people actually recover, so we add a progress event, which removes the infected trait and adds the recovered trait, and has a 20% chance of triggering each day. Now we let it run. The number of people infected will grow as before, but they will also recover, and the more people recovered, the less likely it is for a virus to find a susceptible person. This causes the number of people infected to hit a peak and then decline. Of course, a model this simple can't really make any useful real-world predictions, but the key is that traits and vectors can represent pretty much anything, and adding new factors to the model can make it a lot more accurate. For example, let's say you want to model incubation. Just make the virus vector add an exposed trait that has a daily probability of applying the symptomatic trait. Mortality can be modeled by giving the infected trait a probability of adding the dead trait. To model base mortality, you can give uninfected people a chance to die as well. To model comorbidities and risk factors, you can add pre-existing traits that increase the probability of symptoms developing. Lockdowns can be modeled as government actions which release vectors that apply a temporary quarantine trait, which makes a person less likely to transmit or be infected by the virus, but might also have a chance of developing into frustration or depression. And as people get frustrated, they can also transmit that frustration to other people and become resistant to the vector that applies the quarantine trait. Or maybe quarantine makes some people more compliant, or maybe there are seasonal or economic effects, or maybe politics or personality have an impact, or any one of a number of factors. You get the idea. Basically, it lets you do the same kind of calculations that you've probably tried to do in your head, only now you can actually do the calculations instead of just, imagining it. And it's completely unbiased because it's pretty much just a calculator. All it needs to create a prediction is a coherent theory defined by actual numbers. And once you have a model, you can run it to see how accurately its predictions match up with observable real-world values. While the simulator was designed with disease in mind, it can also be used to model things like economic systems, political parties, religious or secular ideologies, sales figures, crime rates, demographics, etc. Basically any theory that involves population-level statistics. In the upcoming videos, we will explore how to add some of these variables to produce better and more accurate simulations. I will not be using real-world numbers for these models, because I don't want the app itself to become politicized. My goal is to create a tool that allows ordinary people, even those who are not super knowledgeable in complex mathematics, to organize and model their own theories and check them against real-world observations, as well as share their models with other people for examination. Also, you can make games with it, because of course you can.